I get asked quite a few questions about radiograms and where to buy them and what to look for and all the different models, so I thought I'd make a video about, as basically a buyer's guide for buying a radiogram, and hopefully answering some of the questions, the more common questions I get asked. So I think the best place to start is probably on a bit of history and about radiograms and from when they were produced. So basically, by the 30s, radio was in its sort of prime, its golden age, and they were starting to electrify amplification in the gramophones. So as the amplification circuitry already existed in 1930s radios, it made sense to just connect the 78 gramophone electric pickup to the circuitry that already existed in the radio and in the home. So you started to get these little plug-in turntables that you could put in and use the amplifier in your expensive radio you just bought in the 30s, and get the benefit of having amplified sound as opposed to it being completely acoustic. And of course then the manufacturers combined the record player or the gramophone into the cabinet as the radio and made what they call a radiogram, which is a combination of the two. And radiograms were made from the 30s all the way through to the probably the late 70s, by which time hi-fi separates had become popular and portable radios have become much better, much louder, and the need for a large piece of furniture had all basically disappeared. You have to sort of ask yourself, what is it you want to do with a radiogram? The radiograms, being made for such a long period of time, evolve and have all the different types of technology that were available. So the first thing that comes along is FM and stereo. So you have stereo records, so then they become stereograms, which is another sort of marketing word for a radiogram. Then FM comes along, which gives you better radio reception. And then tape recorders come along and they get combined into the unit. Eventually cassette players come along, and then the radiogram then gets taken to bits again and all the parts become separate. So you have separate cassette players, separate tuners and separate turntables. So what sort of started off separate, being combined in one box, eventually became separate towards the end. But yes, if you have to sort of ask yourself, what do you actually want to get out of your radiogram? The 50s radiograms generally tend to be mono. They don't always cover FM, especially the British models. Then by the 60s you get FM, you get stereo, not necessarily stereo FM, but you get stereo capabilities, playback stereo records. And then by the 70s you get transistors and cassettes. As well as the 60s you also get tape recorders that come in. So a lot of them made compartments for tape recorders. So you have to sort of ask yourself, what kind of music are you going to be playing and what kind of records are you going to be playing? The British manufacturers, the radiograms tend to be on the more basic side, the more simple side. But the German manufacturers tended to make lots of mid to high-end radiograms, and they seem to have been imported into the UK in large numbers. So you have things like the Grundig radiograms, which seem to offer more than the British models did at the time. It's basically because the British market British public weren't spending a lot of money on such things, whereas the Germans tended to be spending a lot more money on their music than the British ever did. So I think that's why there are probably lots more interesting models of radiograms in Germany than there are here in the UK. So if you're only interested in playing back 78s, then pretty much your audio is going to be mono, because they didn't do stereo 78, so mono radiogram would be more than adequate for what you want. It then all depends whether you want to make use of the sort of inventions that came with the mono. If you look on my YouTube channels, you'll see quite a few of the radiograms I've got. There's a large 50s from about 1955 Grundig radiogram, which is mono, but it has 6 speakers, and it has what the Grundig calls the 3D sound. Now, a lot of the German manufacturers put lots of speakers in their mono radiograms, and this was to give a better, or to give a more interesting effect with the mono sound. So one of those radiograms would be ideal for somebody who is more interested in the 50s music, 78s, and any music that's recorded in mono. So I would say if you were looking to play 78s and only listening to mono audio, then a mid to late 50s radiogram, especially a German one of the German manufacturers, would be a good choice. And then basically you want to go for as more of a high-end model as you can possibly afford. The British manufacturer radiograms from the 50s would be very basic. You wouldn't have things like push-pull audio, and push-pull audio will give you far better sound output, which you'd probably find with a German set. You would find with some of the high-end models that the British made, but there are many more basic British models that can be found than there are high-end models, because of course the higher-end models are now much more desirable. 5 years ago you couldn't give a radiogram away because the collectors weren't really that interested in them because of their sheer size. The problem with the 50s radiograms is they will be in probably very poor electrical condition. I mean, the reason people were throwing them out was because they were turning them on, plugging them in, trying them, and they sounded dreadful. And of course, they were a large piece of furniture that sounded dreadful, so throw it away. So, if you're not somebody who's capable of restoring, then you'd need to factor this into the price. Radiograms now seem to be very desirable because I think the style of the furniture that they're made in is also fashionable. You can go and buy a sideboard, a modern sideboard that looks like something like this from the 60s or even something from the 50s, and pay hundreds of pounds for it. Or you could buy a radiogram that looks like the sideboard and it comes from the genuine time period, for less than half of that price. So I think it's a combination of different things that mean that the price of radiograms has gone up considerably, even unrestored examples. If you're somebody who's interested in playing your modern stereo records, your 45 singles and your LPs, then you're probably looking for a mid-60s radiogram. By this time, they should be boasting about the fact that they're all stereophonic. So basically it means you have 2 speakers, at least, for left and the right channel. So if you're somebody looking to play stereo records, then a mid-60s radiogram would probably be best. Again, the German manufactured ones would have many more speakers and probably a fancier amplifier. You'd find them in the UK, they'd probably been imported. There are a few of the British made examples which would be very high end, which would be very good. Then you have, if you're interested in listening to stereo FM and stereo records, and you want provision for putting a tape recorder in, then you're looking from the mid-60s, possibly mid-70s, late 70s. This would give you a stereo decoder, In the British made models it would be probably standard by the late 60s, early 70s, but not always, so be careful. But with the German models, probably from the 60s onwards, they would be called either they would include their stereo decoder, like this one does, or you could buy an optional stereo decoder, so you have the option of possibly upgrading it to stereo FM. DAB radio is in a terrible state in this country because there are two different types of standard, and people who invested in DAB radios early on now find that they need to update to DAB Plus to make to receive some of the radio stations that they now can't receive anymore. So they've already upgraded the standard, which has put a lot of people off. So FM is still a good way of listening to radio in this country. Internet radio, of course, and DAB radio, of course, are still options. But in a power cut, if you just want to pick up a radio station, you have a little portable radio, you put a couple of batteries in, and you'll probably pick up FM somewhere in this country, no matter where you are. The other points I can sort of put across is that people forget is nearly all radiograms, bar a few, and I mean it is only a few, they're all ceramic or crystal cartridge turntables, which means that they have fairly high tracking pressure. There's all arguments about what's safe to track a record at, so I'm not going to go down that road because everybody has their own different opinions. But when you're using a ceramic or crystal cartridge, your tracking pressure is generally a bit higher than it would be if you were using a magnetic pickup. So that's something to bear in mind. Also, the earlier the radiogram dates from, the more electrical work it'll probably want doing. I do all the electric work, electronics myself, so that saves me having to outsource any cost that it would be to get somebody to do it for me. And I would say in the majority of cases, the amount of hours that I've put into the radiograms has probably meant that I could never do it as a job. I'd never be able to charge people for my time. It's just taken so much time. It really is kind of a hobby thing. I have no idea why radiograms have become so terribly expensive, especially when it's the amount of work that it takes to get them going. And if you're going to buy a restored radiogram, then you want to buy the most sophisticated model you can afford. Sadly, all the British makers, most of the radiograms you see on the market are what I would consider very basic radiograms. They do not have a push-pull amplifier. They often only have a simple speaker system inside. They do not have a preamplifier, which helps boost the output of the cartridge on the record player. Preamplifiers tended to be fitted to only the German, high-end German models, mid to high-end German models, and what it means is you have an awful lot more volume when you put the radiogram onto a record player. When you change from FM to record player, often on the radiograms without a preamp, you find that the record player output is quite low compared to FM. Also, the bass response from crystal and ceramic cartridges is a lot to be desired. It's often lacking. When you have a magnetic cartridge, the bass tends to be much better. There are some exceptional radiograms, like the one behind me, which you can upgrade to take magnetic pickups, so they only track at very light pressure. Also, most of the German radiograms from the mid-60s onwards, you can get stereo decoders for them, or they have them already built in. So that's great if you want to listen to stereo FM, which we all take for granted now, of course. So yes, it's a bit of a minefield when it comes to buying radiograms. There's lots of variables. There's things like condition. There's the types of turntables. lots of the British domestic models of radiograms have terrible turntables. They have very cheap turntables, and some of them have very good turntables. One of those things about buying a radiogram is, I would say, it's probably not for somebody who wants to get quickly back into listening to vinyl records, because you've got to consider the restoration costs. Often they just will probably wreck your records if you play them without having any restoration done to them. You have to factor in how much work and effort it's going to be to get the thing looking presentable. Often the cabinets are quite bad on them and you need to rub them down and things like that, which is very rewarding, but it's still extra work you've got to put in. So it's not for somebody looking for a fast route into listening to vinyl records. Unless you buy a fully restored example, then you're good to go. For anyone who's got any records they like to collect that are valuable or precious, then you've got to be careful about what kind of turntable you go for in a radiogram. There are only a few radiograms that have turntables that track at very light stylus pressure. And then often the record decks you've got to have serviced, and a lot of the rubber is perished in most of the record decks, so there isn't easily an alternative way of refurbishing the rubber idlers. Not many of them were belt driven. So my advice would be, if you're looking to buy a radiogram and you don't mind putting in a bit of work, go for the highest model that you can. Go for the most expensive model, and the way you do that is basically research. There's a good website called the Radio Museum, Vintage Radio Museum, and most of the radiograms, German or any other country that they're from, or English ones, if you type the model number into Google, it'll give you a rundown of how complicated the how many valves or transistors it uses. It'll probably tell you the record deck that it uses. It's a good way of deciding how good a quality the radiogram was when it was new. But always try to go for the highest end radiogram that you can, and often that means going for German ones because they're far more interesting. However, the more complicated they are, probably the more expensive they are to repair. So you have to ask yourself, what are you looking for in a radiogram? Just something you can play records that you're not too worried about, then a basic British manufactured one would do. Or do you want to get the best you can from get a really period sound from your records? Then you're probably looking to go a little bit more high end, so probably one of the German manufacturers. Anything that has a tape recorder compartment, most of the radiograms don't, but a lot of them have a compartment, especially for a tape recorder. That's another clue that they're probably a bit better quality, because they've given you the provision to install the tape recorder. And tape recorders were always very expensive, much more expensive than turntables. So they obviously envisage that you've got enough money to buy a tape recorder, so they provide you with a tape recorder cabinet. So that's probably a good indication that is a better quality radiogram. I only have one radiogram that doesn't have a tape recorder compartment, and that's a Decca, which you can see on my channel. But it makes up for it in other ways, in its audio amplifier and its speaker arrangement. But yes, on the whole, you want to buy as best a quality radiogram as you can possibly afford, but the downside of that means that repair cost will be much higher. So yes, once you've decided what you actually want to do with your what you actually want to use your radiogram for, then you can probably make a good decision of what sort of model to go for. The more basic British made ones that you see on eBay all the time are way overpriced most of the time. They're not very high quality, and then they're not going to give very much bass. Ceramic cartridges and crystal cartridges do not give a lot of bass output. So I wonder how many people are disappointed with how they sound. And I think that's about all the advice I can give. If you have any questions or anything, then just pop them in the comments below and I will do my best to answer them.